Today we're going to talk about a business paradox. This is National Pastime. This is the game we can consider the first baseball sim of all time. It was created by this man, Clifford Van Beek, who was a kid in his 20s at the time. And it was also a commercial failure, and Van Beek's company went bankrupt in 1932 when it could not pay its debt. 20 years later, this man came onto the scene, J. Richard Seitz. Well, Seitz was 12 years old when he received a copy of National Pastime. I presume that this was a Christmas gift. It could have also been a birthday gift because he was born in February. Anyway, we know that Seitz got that game either in late 1930 or in very early 1931. And we know that because there were notebooks that he left with records of the league that he and his friends formed using National Pastime in early 1931. I presume that Seitz saw a copy of this ad in some magazine, perhaps the Sporting News or Baseball Magazine. Now, Seitz and his friends formed a couple of leagues which they called collectively the American Professional Baseball Association, or APBA. This original National Pastime Neighborhood League was actually a Seitz trade secret. It's something that the community didn't know about until after he died in late 1992. In fact, Seitz loved the game National Pastime so much that he wound up creating his own typewritten cards. I believe that this is a photocopy of an original Stan Hack card that he created sometime in the mid-1930s. And some of the cards were apparently written in by hand, such as this one for Lynn Rowe. Well, the story goes on to talk about how J. Richard Seitz tried to write to Clifford Van Beek sometime in 1932. Seitz wanted to ask for cards for the 1931 baseball season. Of course, at that time, the young Seitz had no idea that Van Beek's Major Games Company had already gone out of business. Seitz's letters came back unopened and undelivered. And, well, Seitz in the end decided that he might as well make his own cards. We know of over 100 cards that Seitz made, most of which were reprinted when the original National Pastime game was reprinted a little over 20 years ago. Now here's where the story becomes really interesting. Seitz went off to boot camp at some point in time for World War II, and he took his National Pastime game with him. Not only did Seitz take the game along with him, but he apparently took a collection of cards with him as well. The community thought for years that these cards were created for the 1942 season. However, I'm convinced that these were actually for 1941, and apparently the strange card and dice game was a hit with some of the men. Now, this is actually really important. You see, Seitz was conducting market research, whether he really realized that or not, and this was really his first major success. Seitz performed enough market research to understand why the game National Pastime was so popular. In fact, he learned that the simplicity of National Pastime, along with the speed with which you could play the game, is what made it a real hit with anybody who bothered to play or to watch. We know that Seitz continued to work on the game after the war, though it's not clear that he actually intended to sell any copies of it. There's an old, long-forgotten story of Seitz creating a 1949 beta set that somebody in Lancaster, Pennsylvania allegedly still had a copy of up to the early 1990s. This set would have been created sometime in early 1950. Now, it's not clear whether this story is true or not, of course, but it fits in pretty well with the 1941 story, and it's another example of Seitz performing market research. And Seitz was really onto something. Now, the amazing thing about National Pastime is that you can finish a game in 20 minutes or less, no matter how much hitting or how much pitching changes you have. It's simple. You roll the dice, you get the result, and you move on to the next batter. There's no math involved, there's nothing complex going on, and honestly, it's pretty addicting. Seitz named his game APBA after the APBA he had enjoyed as a child with his friends. And this is the first APBA advertisement that we know of. It comes from the April 25, 1951 issue of the Sporting News, and the game came with brand new cards representing the 1950 season. But of course, APBA wasn't a direct copy of National Pastime. Seitz also made a number of changes. Well, believe it or not, this point right here has been a focus of debate for over 50 years now. Did Seitz steal another man's game, or was APBA mostly his own invention? Well, I think that it's different enough to count as Seitz's own invention. However, to understand why he made the innovations that he made to National Pastime, you really have to think back to that market research point, the thing we were just talking about. So, you see, the thing is that Seitz knew that the selling point of the game was its simplicity and how quickly you could play it. And so any modification that Seitz made to it had to keep that simplicity and speed intact. Now, you can tell that APBA came from National Pastime. So, for example, this is what the base hit results read on the original National Pastime boards with the bases empty. And here are the same results in the original APBA boards from April 1951. Not only are the results exactly the same, but the wording is also almost exactly the same. But Seitz actually made some really big changes. For example, Seitz came up with the innovation of bringing the infield in to cut off a run at the plate with a runner on third base. This is the sort of innovation you only really notice if you've played National Pastime. Most APBA fans are used to the C for infield in and D for infield deep abbreviations by now, and probably have a hard time imagining playing without it. Well, I ran into this just the other day when I was playing National Pastime. The bases were loaded with one out and the batter rolled play result number 28. I could do nothing to cut off the run at the plate, even though the ball went back to the pitcher. In APBA, you at least had the chance of cutting off the run, though sometimes having the infield in would backfire on you. And then there was the fielding system in general, which consisted of 3 different columns of fielding, theoretically tripling the number of possible results. Now, back in those days, the APBA fielding rules were really simple. Teams had a single team fielding total, and there was nothing that an individual player could do to change that. Also, the impact individual players had on the fielding total depended on their position. A great defensive shortstop like Phil Rizzuto, for example, had a major impact on how well the team fielded. Meanwhile, Joe DiMaggio may have been a great center fielder, but his impact was limited to a maximum of 3 points. Now, this is pretty profound if you sit back and think about it. It's kind of a precursor to the defensive spectrum that Bill James came up with decades later. Seitz knew that certain defensive positions were more valuable than others in the field, and his game reflected that. It also means, by the way, when you go and redraft players or put together your lineup, that you have to be really, really careful because good hitting might not outweigh poor fielding. And then comes the pitching system, which was also simple. Each APBA pitcher received a grade of A, B, C, or D and could sometimes prevent base hits depending on the situation. And so Ed Lopat, for example, would be a little bit more effective in some situations than a pitcher who had a grade of D. Now, most of you, especially these days, probably scoff at this system, and that makes sense to me. I mean, there are many more complex systems out there for pitching, and we'll get to those in later videos. But you have to remember that Seitz wanted to keep things as simple and as fast as possible. So both the fielding and pitching systems of APBA are basically overlays on top of National Pastime. They are designed to work on top of an existing game, and they create some variety and some strategy without making things too complicated. In other words, Seitz was able to innovate without making a mess of the underlying game that worked, which is the second reason why he was so successful. And this brings us to the third reason why Seitz was so successful. He was able to keep his costs down. National Pastime is a beautiful game. The cards that I've seen are still quite clean and well maintained after all these years. The original printing job was nothing short of fantastic. And you know, that was part of the problem. Clifford Van Beek ordered 1,000 games, 500 of which were delivered. He didn't have the money to pay for those, much less the other 500 that he ordered. Which brings us to our third point, which is that Seitz kept his costs down. Well, I don't think that Seitz himself knew the National Pastime's creator had actually gone out of business. However, the truth is that Seitz was a lot more careful with his expenses. In fact, it's almost certainly true that Seitz kept his innovations as simple as he could to prevent costs from going up too high. Sometime in the 1960s, Clifford Van Beek revised National Pastime to create results that were half on pitchers' cards and half on hitters' cards. It was sort of like a mix between Strat-O-Matic and APBA. The problem, of course, is that you then need to have 2 sets of cards for the pitchers, one for pitching and one for hitting. Okay, there are a lot of valid criticisms of the APBA pitching system. However, when you think about it, you really have to keep in mind that one of Seitz's goals was to keep costs down as much as he possibly could. Why, you ask? Well, it's obvious. He didn't know that his system was going to actually last. Printing a whole bunch of extra cards at the very beginning would have upset that sort of economic balance that he was seeking to get. That brings us to the fourth main point, which is that Seitz stuck with it even when it didn't work at first. Though we often think of Seitz as being immediately successful, the truth is that he wasn't. In fact, he didn't have success for years. The truth is that Seitz had only 137 copies of the first edition of APBA printed. That's a little over a fourth of Van Beek's initial print run of 500. Now, I apologize for this. I can't find the source at the moment. I'm going to have to dig through the old APBA Journal archive. I do remember reading somewhere, however, that APBA remained in the red until somewhere around 1955. Maybe one of you can help me with a source on this somewhere in the comments. It wasn't really until around 1957 that J. Richard Seitz was able to quit his day job and sell APBA full-time. And in truth, finally going full-time is what allowed Seitz to perfect his original formula and provided the backbone for the long-term success of the company. And of course, APBA is a company that still is going on today after 75 years of ups and downs. Now, it's not a perfect game. I know that. In fact, I say that all the time. But the truth is that it still is a lot of fun. It's as much fun today as it was back in 1942 when Seitz was playing it with people in a boot camp. And the thing is that APBA succeeds because of the four things that Seitz did here. Because of that effective market research, because his innovations were simple and didn't bog the game down or turn it into a mess, because his original costs of printing were low and are still relatively low today, and because Seitz stuck with it even when he wasn't successful at first.